He turned up around 6 months ago. It was a student who noticed him first, since every day he'd walk past the town's high school at around the same time. The kids would be out in the yard, playing basketball and gossiping, would stop what they were doing to watch him stroll by. He never looked at us, but by God did we make a game out of looking at him. What got everyone was how he dressed. He didn't show a speck of skin. His entire body was covered with some piece of clothing. It looked like a kid who'd gotten into their parents' closet. Everything he wore was mismatched and tattered. Usually it'd be a long, brown duster coat, tartan slacks, and a horribly stained shirt. Occasionally he'd throw in a scarf or a hat, or maybe a second coat under the duster. He wore gloves, sometimes leather, sometimes silk, and a tweed mask. His mask was hard to explain. It wrapped around his head perfectly with no visible seams or eye holes. We didn't know whether he could see or not, but he never had any trouble walking or crossing the road. I think it's the mask that really got people's imagination wearing. Some of the kids guessed he might have a rare skin disease. Others thought that he might have been a worker at the old chemical plant and was badly burned when the factory burnt down, but that would have made him at least 90 years old. A bunch of older kids spread the rumor that he was some sick serial killer, laying low in our sleepy town, covering his face in case someone recognizes him from a wanted poster or breaking news bulletin. Everyone liked to propound from the sidelines, but no one had the guts to actually find out. Not until tonight. It was the 26th of October. School had just ended for a week-long break and I was going to my first real party. I barely knew the guy whose house it was at, but I leapt at the chance of underage drinking. The night turned out great. We all had fun and managed to not throw up once. I downed a whole packet of apple-flavored chewing gum to try and mask the smell of alcohol on my breath from my parents, although I had a feeling they'd be able to tell anyway. Me and 3 close friends left the party just before 11 and set off staggering home. We passed my friend Luke's house first. As he walked up to his front door, a light came on and his mother stepped out, her face contorted with pure anger. We laughed at Luke and stumbled on our way as he realized he mixed up the dates and forgot to tell his parents he was going out tonight. Me, Shane and Rowan kept messing around as we navigated our way back home. Shane's house was next, and since I lived so far out, I was planning on having a sleepover at Rowan's. We turned a corner, still laughing from a joke we made a block ago, and saw someone. All 3 of us crouched behind the fence, peeping out from behind to confirm our suspicions. Walking down the middle of the road was the masked man. He was in his usual getup, only he'd taken off his gloves. We all squinted to try and get a better look. The only light we had came from a pathetic, constantly buzzing street lamp, but we were desperate to finally see what he's been hiding. All of a sudden he turned and began walking up to a house. He stepped up onto the porch and opened the door. Just as he walked inside, we could see him slowly take off his mask, and then the door slammed shut behind him. The 3 of us looked at each other, all thinking the same thing. The mystery of what the masked man looked like was still that, a mystery. He had his back to us, and even in perfect daylight we wouldn't have been able to make his face out. The first one of us to commit our thoughts to speech was Shane. He told us, pumping out his chest, that he was gonna go see which of the rumors was true. He said he had a plan, and before me or Rowan could say anything, Shane was already halfway across the street. We looked at each other and followed him, coming up to the masked man's old house. It was noticeably more run down than the other houses on the block. The paint was peeling, the gutter had almost fallen down, and an upstairs window had been shattered. The 3 of us stood around the front door, keeping our voices low as Shane explained his grand plan. He said he was going to simply knock on the front door. When the masked man answered, he'd say, "Oh sorry, wrong house," and then just turn around and leave, but not before getting a good eyeful of him. We all thought that it was a flawless plan and egged him on as we took our hiding place behind a bush at the end of the masked man's property. As I got a good look at the house, I realized that I recognized it. My dad had this friend who had gone through a rough divorce. He slept in our spare room for a few weeks before he eventually won the house back in the court settlement. Around 6 months ago, he moved out of town without so much as a goodbye. I could remember when I was much younger him showing his car off to me. That thing was his pride and joy. I couldn't believe this was the same house. My thoughts were bisected by the sound of Shane rapping his knuckles on the front door. He turned to look at us and gave us a dumb grin and a thumbs up. I think he was about to crack a joke when the door opened. Standing at the entrance was the masked man. He'd taken off his mask, as well as most of his clothes. That much I could make out as he was still shrouded in shadows. There wasn't a single light on in his house, and to me and Rowan he wasn't anything more than a silhouette. As we both tried to discreetly get a better look, Shane began stuttering out his excuse. Suddenly, he stopped. There was a pause before he began to scream in a shrill pitch. We watched as the masked man grabbed Shane by his lower jaw and violently yanked him inside the house, the door slamming shut behind him. Me and Rowan looked on in shock. I turned to Rowan to ask him what we should do, but before I could speak he was up and running to the front door. He started pounding on it and yelling expletives. I ran up behind him and yanked him away. I held him and asked if he was crazy. As he began mumbling a response, the front door began to open. We both bolted like a greyhound out of a trap and dived behind the corner of the house. We stayed there, holding our breath and waiting to meet the same fate as Shane. Eventually, Rowan found enough courage to peep around the edge of the wall. He didn't see anyone. He moved out a little further and saw that the door was still closed. I pulled him back and told him that we should call the police. He snorted and explained to me that they'd probably arrest us for underage drinking. We'd spend the night in some jail cell, and by the time we could explain ourselves, Shane would be dead. Before I could question his reasoning, Rowan walked over to a window, cupped his hands and peeked in. I sighed, frustrated, and asked if he saw anything. He was replying with a long, drawn-out no when suddenly he yelped and crouched down. Seeing his reaction, I instinctively did the same. I crawled over to him and in a voice just below a whisper I asked him what he'd seen. I could see the fear in his eyes as he told me that saw the masked man, now mostly derobed, walking out from what he guessed was a door to the basement. After that, Rowan started muttering to himself about how the masked man must have seen him. I knew that Shane, my best friend for as long as I could remember, was in the basement. My stomach churned thinking about what I had to do next. I held my breath as I stood and peered in through the window. I couldn't see the masked man anywhere. I nudged the window and my suspicions were confirmed. Like the front door, the window was left unlocked and slightly ajar. I tried to steady my breath as I pulled the window all the way open. Rowan looked at me in shock as I asked him to give me a leg up. Still, he complied. Once I was inside, I pulled him in after me. Before I did, he grabbed a fist-sized rock from the garden. For self-defense, he told me. The house was perfectly still. Every surface was covered in a thin veneer of dust. We both stood there for a second, trying to hear the masked man. There wasn't a sound, other than the faint dripping of some faraway faucet. In what we thought was relative safety, we crept our way to the door the masked man had emerged from. I gently opened it and sure enough, I was met with a staircase descending into the impenetrable darkness of the basement. I didn't dare call out Shane's name in fear that he wouldn't be the only one who'd hear me. Instead, I began my way down the stairs, Rowan following right behind me. My mother had given me a small wind-up torch, so I could make my way home safely at night, she said. I fished around in my coat pocket for it, my hand clutching the familiar metal. Just as I reached the bottom, I found the button and switched it on, finally illuminating the room. It took me a while to realize what I was seeing, but judging from Rowan's deafening scream, he knew right away. Shane was hanging upside down from the ceiling, a chained hook driven through both of his ankles. He had long, fresh cuts across his throat, wrists, and legs, which were all pouring with blood. The blood dripped down into a series of angled metal sheeting, which directed the flow into a steel trough. There were 4 other bodies hanging from chains, all serving the same purpose. Some looked like they'd been there for weeks. We both turned and ran. As we scrambled back up the stairs, my torch beam fell on the figure standing motionless in the doorway. We slowly stepped back down the stairs until we were at the bottom again. We froze, watching for any sign of movement. Suddenly, the figure began to lift slowly off the ground. In an instant, it shot down the stairs, flying through the air like it had been thrown. I dived out of the way, but Rowan wasn't as lucky. The thing piled into him and pinned him to the ground. As I got to my feet, I saw it run its black, claw-like fingernails across his neck. I screamed and the masked man turned to look at me. It lifted itself to its feet and lunged. I grabbed the rusted hook dangling from the chain above me and swung it. It plowed into the front of the thing's head, caving it in. It went limp. The momentum from swinging the hook almost made me fall backwards into the trough of blood. I steadied my footing and dropped down next to Rowan. He laid motionless. There was a gaping wound along the side of his neck and he didn't so much as gurgle. I knew there was nothing I could do. With tears streaking down my cheeks, I turned and began to somberly make my way up the flight of stairs. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw something move. I turned to look and saw the masked man yank the rusted claw out of its head and stand. It straightened itself and turned to meet my gaze. I ran frantically up the remaining steps. I could hear the thing let out an animalistic screech as it flew through the air behind me. I burst out of the basement and into the living room, making a clear dash for the front door. The masked man threw itself into me, sending me spiraling. I landed on a glass coffee table, which shattered from the force. I lay in pain on a bed of broken glass as the creature that had killed my friends loomed. It dropped down on top of me and lowered its face agonizingly close to mine. It was now that I finally got a good look at what it looked like under the mask. The thing's face looked like a naked mole rat, bleached white with chemicals. Its eyes were a mess of tumors and scar tissue, filled with a black-purple pus festering in the sockets. The soft tissue of its nose and ears looked partially digested. The gums were black and oozing a mephitic ichor, lined with fragments of tooth bits. Its front two cuspids, however, looked perfectly maintained and began protruding even further out. They now looked longer than my index finger and as sharp as razor wire. I shoved a shard of glass deep into the thing's neck. It pierced clean through to the vertebrae, embedding itself. Black, tar-like blood began to ooze, then spurt violently, out of the wound. The masked man fell backwards, writhing around on the floor in pain. I staggered to my feet, limping to the front door before breaking into a half-sprint. Afraid it would come after me, I ran straight to the next-door neighbor. I began pounding in their door until I saw a light come on upstairs. I heard movement in the house and the door opened. Blinking the sleep out of his eyes and wearing a lime green bathrobe was Gary, my Sunday school teacher. He recognized me instantly and brought me into the safety of his home when he saw that I was drenched in blood. He laid a plastic sheet on a couch and told me to sit while he made tea. I sat and tried to catch my breath. I was still reeling from the night's events. Still, I felt safe in Gary's front room. It smelt like my grandma's house. I took out my phone and with a shaking finger tried to ring my mother. The kettle boiled and Gary poured my tea. He walked in from the kitchen, handed me the mug and sat down next to me. We called the police and I spent the next few minutes trying to explain to him what had happened. Once I had, he seemed to go into shock. He just sat there, bound by my words. Eventually he snapped out of it and slowly turned to look at me. He told me that I could go clean up in his downstairs bathroom and I realized the state I must be in. He showed me to the bathroom and left me to wash myself. It felt good to scrub the foetid grime from my skin. I tried to avoid looking at myself in the mirror. I was drying my face with a hand towel when I heard a knocking at Gary's front door. I assumed it was either my mother or the police and, evidently, so did Gary. The next thing I heard was his scream, followed by the door being thrown open. His screams were cut short and replaced with the bestial growl coming from what could only be the masked man. I turned to the bathroom door and frantically fumbled with the key, locking it. I dropped to the floor and curled up in a ball under the sink as I began to sob quietly to myself. I heard labored footsteps coming from the hallway. Within seconds, they were just outside the door. A low scratching noise came, followed by a thunderous pounding as the masked man tried desperately to break down the door. Its hinges rattled as wood began to splinter. The midsection buckled and split. I could hear the wailing of sirens as police cars neared as the masked man's hand crept from the hole in the door. It felt around for the lock as pus leaked from the soft flesh and exposed nerve surrounding its black-purple fingernails. I could hear vehicles pulling up outside as I watched it hook its talons around the key. It ripped it, and the rest of the door handle, from the wood, sending splinters flying around the room. A group of police officers made their way through the front door. One swore to God when he saw what was left of Gary. The bathroom door fell to the side. The masked man stood in the hallway, staring into my soul and priming its teeth, which began protruding even further from its gums. There was a deafening gunfire and I clasped my hands around my ears, screaming as I watched the masked man get shot maybe half a dozen times. It staggered back then dropped to all fours as the police opened fire again. It climbed up the wall and began crawling upside down along the ceiling. 3 officers gave chase as one barged his way past the broken bathroom door and took my hand, leading me out of the house. I saw my mother's car parked amongst the police cars. She stood next to it, crying as 2 officers tried to console her. She saw me and ran over, wrapping me in her arms. The police kept me a little while longer to take a witness statement. Eventually my mother convinced them to let me come home with her. They agreed, took our address and told us that they'd call around tomorrow morning to talk further. I climbed into the back of my mother's car as she began to drive. She was silent, letting me rest as we neared our home. Soon, the rows of houses were replaced with trees. I watched them go by as I felt myself drifting off to sleep. The last thing I can remember of that night was seeing a white blur, something keeping pace with the car just beyond the tree line.